going to produce like Picasso. In ancient times, art teachers told their students finishing is better than starting. Today, you're going to learn about the greatest artist of the 20th century and perhaps the greatest producer of all time, Pablo Picasso. Our story begins on August 25th, 1944. History would mark this day as Liberation Day in Paris. The skies above Paris are filled with spectacular dogfights. The British Royal Air Force is greatly outnumbered. Bullets and bombs are bursting in air. Axis and Allies debris litters the landscape below. In Paris, it is the third day of fighting. It is neighborhood to neighborhood, building to building, street to street combat. Urban warfare at its worst. Snipers are even known to shoot civilians and soldiers alike from the rooftops above. And tuning out all of the chaos that is Liberation Day is Pablo Picasso. Spanish-born, living in Paris over 30 years. He's focusing in on a painting. And bam! A stray bullet goes through the window, narrowly missing his head. Picasso drops to the floor, his model right next to him. He waits for a few seconds. He says to his model, "My dear, we must leave." So he picks up the model, grabs his art supplies, his canvases, his dog, puts them into the back of the car, and speeds off to a more secure location. He can hear the rat-a-tat-tat of bullets on the next street over and the roar of airplane engines above him. On Liberation Day in Paris, Pablo Picasso finished 5 paintings. Finishing is better than starting. Why Picasso? My name is Brian Sullivan. We'll use the hashtag Picasso for this presentation. I do design strategy and execution at a local company. I'm a writer and speaker. I'm up here today. I've also been at South by Southwest. My co-presenter today is Schuh. He's the animated one. He's written a really good book called Brilliance. He's a teacher and he's a very creative person. He does concept art, illustrations, user experience design, motion graphics, animation, and video games. You guys are here today. What I want to talk about first is go back a few years. I presented a talk that is the sister presentation to this one called Design Like Da Vinci at South by Southwest a few years ago. And one of the things that I said in that talk is that Da Vinci was probably the most prolific sketcher of all time. He produced 13,000 pages of sketches. Now when you think about it, when you start a project, you might sketch things out, but that's really just the first 10% of the work. That's only starting. When you look at finishing, though, he only finished 30 completed works of art. A great starter, a terrible finisher. So we got to thinking, I was talking to Jay, and we wanted to know who was the greatest artist of all time. Who produced the most? It wasn't even close. When we did our research, Pablo Picasso finished 147,800 completed works of art, according to the Guinness Book of World Records. Now, that's an incredible number. We've got to get a better understanding. So what's some perspective on 147,800? Well, Spanish-born artists living in Paris. The largest museum in Paris is the Louvre. It only holds 35,000 pieces of art. Pablo Picasso once said, "Give me a museum and I'll fill it up." He could fill this museum up 4 times over. So what you essentially have is a tale of 2 masters. Da Vinci was great at the first 10%. Picasso was phenomenal at the last 10%. Da Vinci can start strong, 13,000 pages of sketches, but Pablo Picasso has 13,500 finished paintings in that 147,800 number. Now, some other interesting facts about Picasso. He's the most stolen artist in the world. 1,147 pieces of his work have been stolen. When you think of the daily average for his 75-year career, Pablo Picasso had to finish 7 completed works of art. That's almost 1 an hour. It's phenomenal. You probably know Picasso for his periods, traditional period, blue period, rose period. This is a man that was prolific his entire life, constantly reinventing himself. When we looked at the top 50 paintings of all time sold at auction, Picasso has 10 of the top 50. This is a prolific producer. We come back to this number, 147,800 completed works of art. It's too much. So what we had to do is continue doing our research. So we read 13 books in a year, discussed almost daily what this meant. And the question that Jay and I had for ourselves was, how can we apply all of these lessons from Picasso to our own work? And we came up with the framework that we want to share with you today. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the entire purpose of this talk, is this slide. Get out your cameras and take a quick picture of this. This is the whole reason why we're here today. There are 5 P's to productivity according to Picasso. Passion, that's the fuel that gets you up in the morning. Purpose, that's the engine that drives you throughout the day. Proficiency is your mastery of methods, tools, and techniques. Persistence is what happens when you get stuck. Partnerships is what you need when you encounter a wicked problem. We all have to be productive in our daily lives. We will all struggle. For those of you who are students trying to learn your craft, what I want to say to you right now, the 5 P's of productivity are how you become an effective professional. If you are a professional now struggling on a project, one of these 5 P's will help you push through whatever the problem is. Passion is where it all begins, though. Passion is the fuel that drives you.
So I don't know why Brian wanted me to do this section. Right? Passion does lead to productivity. Picasso said, art is a lie which makes us see the truth. So in this section, we're going to cover, how do you find your passion? How do you get support? How do you educate yourself? And then something we're all working on, probably here at this conference, is developing your brand, whether it's for yourself or your company. And then those events that happen to every single one of us in this room, they can either derail us from our passion or help us find down deep inside that thing to keep us going. And Picasso did that. We know that one of Picasso's first words is piz, which is short for pencil in Spanish. So it seems right from the beginning, he knew kind of intuitively what he wanted to do. His father was known for painting doves, and when he recognized this natural idea for Picasso and interest in art, he began to give him lessons. It said there's a story in his biography in which he and his sister used to have this game in which they would cut out little animals. And his sister would challenge him and said, well, start the dog from the tail. Start the dog from the back and the head. Years later, he said, this little game is what accounted for his magical ability to start a drawing from any place on the canvas. This is Picasso's first oil painting at age 9. When his father saw it, he essentially wanted to give up painting. Now, he had a huge desire to build his brand. And I'm not even going to attempt his real name that's on this slide. But when we look, we see that his mother's maiden name was Maria Picasso y Lopez. And Picasso said, can you imagine me being called Ruiz or Pablo Ruiz, even Diego Jose Ruiz? No, so he tried all of these different signatures, and then he noticed that double S's in Spanish are very rare, except in Matisse, Rousseau, and so he said it will be in Picasso. He went to the Barcelona School of Fine Arts, and in a test that normally takes students about a month, he finished in a week and was instantly accepted. Although he hated school, he got bored, and so he was a bad student, and he was sent to detention. He loved it. He could take a sketchbook and draw there by himself every day. Although he did have events in his life, and his sister, who was very dear to him, got very sick. And he made a vow to God. He said, if you save my sister, I will give up my art. When she died that Christmas, he began to paint like the devil. Picasso's father wanted him to be a teacher. Anybody have parents that want you to do something? Right? How many of you are doing what your parents wanted you to do? Right? He said every act of creation is first an act of destruction, and that in art you must first kill one's father. And he went to Paris to pursue his dream. So what have we gone over real quickly? We found you need to find your passion. If you're living a life without passion, from my perspective, it's a life not worth living. That's a cold statement, but a lot of people you know are doing things that they hate on a day-to-day basis. And I encourage you at things like this to find your passion. Family support is important. Right? Find a mentor. For Picasso, it was his father. Get an education, even if it's just for the sake of learning. And then when those events that happen in life happen, get up, dust yourself off, and keep going.
Purpose. Passion's the fuel that drives you. Purpose is your engine that gets you through the day. Picasso once said, good artists copy, great artists steal. What we're going to talk about here is you have to seek new experiences, defy the status quo. Do not copy, plunder from the past, and look beyond your own design discipline. Now, a lot of people struggle with the concept of good artists copy, great artists steal. And a lot of you really love Apple products and Steve Jobs. You might be interested to know that the design hero of Steve Jobs was Pablo Picasso. In fact, Steve Jobs used to say, good artists copy, great artists steal all the time. Now here's really what it means. Copying is doing exactly the same thing as someone else. It's a rip, it's a knockoff, it's an imitation, it's not original. Stealing, however, is when you take something and you change it so much, in such a little way, it's a refinement, it's disguised, yet it looks like it belongs to you. Here's the original branding of the Mac. This is known as the Picasso Mac. Steve Jobs hated this branding. Good artists copy. This was a mimicry, an imitation, a knockoff. Now, many of you have a Mac. You'd probably be interested to know that the Finder's icon on your Mac is a Picasso. What you see here on the right is Picasso's two characters from 1934. Clearly you can see the Finder's icon there. Now, I bet you my bottom dollar that Steve Jobs knew this quote from Pablo Picasso, I do not seek, I find. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a Picasso on your Mac that you see every day. Picasso was shown in the Think Different ads. He was one of the first 10 people to be shown. The Apple Store, something that you guys think is just greatly original, is actually inspired by the Ritz-Carlton. Steve Jobs brags in an article that's in Forbes about how the Apple Store would be the Ritz-Carlton of retail. At the Ritz-Carlton, somebody greets you at the door when you come in. They do the exact same thing at the Apple Store. At the Ritz-Carlton, somebody will check you into the hotel, or they'll point you to the hotel bar. At the Apple Store, you can check out the different products that are there, or they'll point you to the Genius Bar in the back, where they dispense help and marketing. Steve Jobs said about the original Mac that they were shameless, absolutely shameless about stealing ideas. He talks about sans serif font, historians, craftsmen, musicians, all hired to do the first Mac. You can look this up on the Huffington Post from a 2011 article where he brags about how shamelessly they created the Mac by ripping everything off and plundering from the past. Now here's the thing. Jobs continually innovated, putting things on the line. Computers, tablets, smartphones. Picasso's doing the same things with those traditional periods that he had. Neoclassical, Cubism, everything on the line is an artist and a craftsman. And Dr. Enrique Mallon of the Picasso Project would say Steve Jobs greatly admired Picasso because he could have taken a conventional approach and done it all well for the rest of his life. Made a ton of money. But like Jobs, Picasso put everything on the line at all times. Another great quote that Steve Jobs loved from Picasso is real artists ship. Create it, ship it, ship it, ship it. If you don't do anything, get it out the door, get it out the door. There's an interesting story from Picasso's life where he was with his friend Gertrude Stein at lunch, and Matisse, who was his rival, actually found some statues of some African masks, and he was so excited that he bought them right away. He bursts into the lunch with Matisse and Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein, the great artist and writer, and Matisse loved the statues for their craftsmanship, the cut, the stone. Picasso loved them for their magical qualities. The masks both reveals and conceals, just like the finder's icon. It influenced Picasso like you wouldn't believe. From this one lunch meeting, this chance encounter, for 3 years he has an African influence period. These are just a sampling of 3 paintings. A mask reveals and conceals. This leads to an early Cubist work known as the Young Ladies of Avignon that brings in the 20th century. Picasso would say, to copy oneself is more dangerous than to copy others because that leads to sterility. He was always reinventing himself. So what do we learn from our purpose points of Picasso? You've got to have an open mind to new experiences. Be original. Challenge the status quo. Look beyond your own design discipline. Steal great ideas, but don't copy them. And great artists ship.
So partnerships, proficiency, jumping ahead. Passion is the fuel that gives you the energy to keep moving forward. Purpose, right? You can't move forward without purpose. And then proficiency is the mastery of tools, techniques, and methods. This is one of the things that I would challenge every one of you in this audience to think about this quote. I am doing that which I cannot do in order to learn how to do it. Out of fear, we have a tendency not to do the things we don't know how to do because we don't want to look silly, stupid, right? Think of the things that you have not done in your life that you want to do, but because out of fear and you don't know how to do it, you don't. So how do we get around this? Well, get an education. If you don't know how to do it, find a place where they're teaching you how to do it. Right? Find a creative space. Some space that you can work and feel comfortable being uncomfortable. You've got to research. Practice. And network. We learned that Picasso's father taught him brush techniques and that he attended the Barcelona School of Fine Arts. When he was about 14, his father got him a studio. And he worked in solitude with the exception of a cat, some dogs, and even a monkey. Right? But maids were not allowed to clean. Later, he shared the studio, but Picasso set the rules. He said, I'm going to tell you when you can eat, sleep, and paint. And Picasso saved the evening time to work because he preferred to work alone and in solitude. He would often skip school and go to the museums, where he loved the works of El Greco and Goya, and he continued to do his research. These are the paintings of a 17 and 18-year-old Picasso. This wasn't homework, this was his own work. Picasso learned the value of his network from his father and would form what's called tertulias. His first tertulia was called the Four Cats, and they would talk about art and music, and current events, literature, and more. Later on, when he joined the French avant-garde, you can see his network. Henri Matisse, Salvador Dali, George O'Keeffe, Henry Miller, Miles Davis, Andy Warhol. These are the people he hung out with. Similar, and you have similar opportunities right here at this conference. Many tonight, the after party, you can hang out with people that are changing the world. There may be an opportunity for have one of the people that are at this conference join your network. Think about that, instead of just going home because you're tired. So we've got to move beyond just pushing pixels. When you keep doing what you already know how to do, you're not growing. You've got to get an education, and you've got to be self-disciplined enough to learn on your own. You've got to research, practice, and network.
Persistence. This is what you need when you get stuck. Picasso once said, "It took me 4 years to paint like Raphael, but a lifetime to paint like a child." Now here's what's important in this section. You've got to establish a routine, develop a process, learn from your setbacks, master different design disciplines, and take a long view. Seek longevity in your career. Now, I'm going to show you his routine based on our research. This is what he did when he was 90. He lived till he was 96. He would wake up around 10 a.m., eat and exercise, start what I would call his first shift, take a little nap. He would end work. With his network, he would go to a nice dinner, talk about the different things that he was interested in, and then he would begin his second shift around 11 o'clock at night. And then he would sleep and then rinse and repeat until the day he died. Now, you remember the story that I told you at the beginning about Liberation Day in Paris? The day after Liberation Day, Picasso would say, "Paris is liberated, but Picasso is besieged." In fact, there are so many visitors that thought Picasso had died at some point. They hadn't seen him in years. French resistance fighters, reporters, artists, GIs, art dealers wanted to connect with the great master. In fact, the San Francisco Chronicle, 2 days after Liberation Day, would say, "Picasso found alive." That was the headline in World War II. His schedule is completely thrown off, though. Picasso is forced to open up office hours. All of you guys that want to see me, Thursday only. It's not enough to just set a schedule, you've got to have good habits. This is his routine, his habit. So when you find that space, when you're going to work, your schedule, you've got to have good habits then. He would produce a series of rough sketches, explore alternatives, iterate, reduce those down, and then begin his project. He would pick what was workable. In later years, he wanted to save that, and he would take photos. And then he would finish it and then document it in a journal because real artists ship. And he would usually do this in less than an hour. Every project. 7 projects every day. Now, persistence though. Here's an interesting story of when he got stuck. This is a really famous photo. It's called The Head of Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein was his patron for a many number of years in Paris. In fact, he wasn't able to sell much artwork for a while, except to Gertrude and Leo Stein. He's trying to do this painting, and he gets stuck on Gertrude's head, and he's stumped, he's blocked. He can't figure out how to do it. There's something about the shape that is bothering him. He's stressed out. He goes to Barcelona. And one of the interesting things is, as he's working with clay, he all of a sudden has his aha moment, and he does this painting that you see on the right immediately from memory. Gertrude Stein loved it. She would put this on the cover of books that weren't even about her. Picasso mastered different design disciplines. You see lithographs, ceramics. This is a curtain from a play where he met his first wife, Olga. He did costume design. The people of Chicago are still trying to figure out what this massive sculpture is of Picasso. He's also unnamed. And of course, we know about his paintings. He was very persistent in his career. Think about Paris for a moment. He wanted to go there, and his dad was really nervous about it. The first time that he visited, spectacular failure. He almost starves to death. The second time, he gets a disease and almost dies. His sister had to go get him. He comes back again a few years later. He has an art exhibit, and he is the laughingstock of Paris. And then finally, after his fourth visit to Paris, he has marginal success. This is what you have to do in your career. You sometimes have to persist. For Picasso, it was Paris or bust. Now, he was persistent in his blue period. This is an interesting fact about Picasso. They didn't initially sell well. And what had happened is a good friend of his had committed suicide. And what you'll see is the painting always show a man from one side. That's the image of his friend. It's known as the good side, because on the other side, he placed a gun. It was almost some type of therapy for Picasso. These paintings didn't sell well. They were just too dark for people. 20 years later, they fetched the most money at auctions. He was persistent in business. He sold art in Germany and Russia during the early 1910s. France just didn't want the blue period. He sold directly to Leo and Gertrude Stein and didn't exhibit in Paris for a number of years because people simply ripped him off. Now, Gertrude Stein was a fabulous marketer. Here's what her apartment looked like back in the day. Picasso's art is shown all over it. She was an avid Picasso fan. Now, her brother Leo loved Matisse, and they would hang those Picassos and Matisse next to each other, creating a small rivalry for people. Picasso had no exhibits for almost 20 years in Paris. Think about persistence long term. That's longevity. Again, blue period, rose period, cubism, neoclassical. This is a man always reinventing himself. Gertrude Stein would say this about her great friend. Picasso empties himself and then fills himself up completely again, empties himself. He's doing it 7 times a day, 147,800 times in his 75-year career. This was the secret to Picasso, emptying and filling, empty and fill, empty and fill. Here's your persistent points from Picasso. Know that your creative process beats any creative block that you might have. It is your schedule and good work habits that allow you to push through. See setbacks as learning experiences. Master new design disciplines. Remember the head of Gertrude Stein. He has his aha moment in the painting while crafting with clay. Empty, fill, and do not fear to begin again.
This is one of my favorites, obviously. I wanted to even talk about it earlier. It's partnership. We live in a world where we want to do things ourselves. We want to make something for ourselves, feel good about ourselves. But really, partnerships are where the magic happens. as we go through the 5 Ps, we see that Picasso had different types of partnerships. He had his family, he had mentors, he had his tertulia, or his network, but we're also going to examine here his rivals and his collaborators. His uncle Salvador paid for his art school, and his mother was his emotional support, and she would write to him constantly while he was in Paris. His father taught him brush techniques and even stretched his canvas, and he said, every time I draw a man, I instantly think of my father. When he moved to Paris, he met Max Jacobs, who taught him French and introduced him to other artists. They even shared an apartment for a short time. Here's some paintings by Picasso with his friend. He also met Apollinaire. They both loved African art and poetry, detective novels. Apollinaire first came up and positively reviewed Cubism, and then came up with the term surrealism to describe some of the artwork in the ballet Parade. He drew inspiration from his tertulia, as we see and have talked about earlier. Writers, dancers, journalists, poets, models, photographers, and even biographers. He had an historic rivalry with Matisse. He said, no one looks at more paintings the way I do than at Matisse's painting more than me, and no one looks at my paintings more than Matisse. Their friends loved this rivalry. In fact, Richard Stein was a huge fan of Picasso, and her brother Leo was a huge fan of Matisse. So what they do is they'd have dinner parties. They'd invite both artists, put up the artwork, and then have the crowd say, okay, whose is better? Right? Now, they would also swap paintings, Matisse and Picasso, and Picasso got one of Matisse's portraits of his daughter, Marguerite. And of course, Jacobs and Apollinaire were pro-Picasso, so they would come over to his house and throw darts at the painting. Now, we don't know if he approved of it, but he didn't stop it either. This is Henri Matisse's The Joy of Life. It's a pastoral setting where nude figures are dancing and talking and making love in a park, and Picasso hated it, loathed it. So a year later, he responded to Matisse's work with The Young Ladies of Avignon, which Brian told you earlier was probably one of the most published works in books in the 20th century. Instead of being away from the scene, you were up close. Instead of a park, you were in a brothel. And rather than passively view the scene, you had to actively choose from one of the prostitutes, some of them wearing African masks. It's a complete rejection of Matisse's work. Good artists copy, great artists steal. And we see this. Similar subjects, different context. At times they're extremely competitive. And on June 16, 1931, Matisse did the largest retrospective of his art Paris had ever seen. Critics hated it. In fact, it said Matisse left early. Picasso stayed to the very end. In a very passive-aggressive move, he went to the owner of the salon and said, hey, how about we do another one of these 1 year from now, like exact day? So on June 16, 1932, in 7 months, Picasso produced 225 paintings, 7 statues, and 6 illustrated books. Because Picasso had not shown his work in Paris for over 20 years, it was a huge success. Very competitive. However, what's interesting is there's a story where Picasso, Matisse, and a group of his friends went to a restaurant to eat, hang out. And Matisse got up and went to the restroom and was taking a little while. So Picasso kind of joked and he said, oh, he must be resting on his crown of his laurels. And the other friends picked up on it and said, yeah, that Matisse, started making fun of him. Picasso got pissed off. He said, I refuse to let you insult Matisse. He is one of our greatest painters. So Picasso really respected and admired Matisse. Now, your rivals will take you to a new level, but it's your collaborators that really take you to greater heights. And he met George Barak, and they described their relationship as two men tied together on the side of a mountain with a rope, making their way up the mountain, talking constantly, trying to maneuver this thing as they developed Cubism. The first stage was analytic Cubism, in which we can see here analytic shapes are put together, geometric shapes, to make a guitar. The next stage was synthetic Cubism, in which Picasso added different materials, wallpaper, sheet music, even hair into the canvas. What's really interesting, Picasso is known to have a huge ego, but it's during this period that he did not write a journal and they did not sign the paintings. He suppressed his ego in true collaboration with his partners. They met daily for almost 7 years. Then came World War I, and Barak went off to fight. At the end of World War I, Barak got injured, and their friendship ended. He had a brain injury, and their friendship ended. It's also a time where he met his first wife, Olga. Brian spoke to that earlier, and they had a son. She was a ballet dancer in a parade. So let's talk about partnerships. Partnerships, out of all of the P's, are one of the most important things to productivity. Brian and I like to say we're better together. This conference is proof of that. Your family sets you up for success. It's important. Your mentors educate you. Find a mentor. If you don't have one, find one. Rivals can push you harder, but it's your collaborators that are really going to help you go to greater heights.
So what we want to do is give a case study, an example, and dive into the 5 Ps, looking at Picasso's Guernica from 1937. So Picasso used the 5 Ps as a young artist to learn his craft. It started with passion, purpose, proficiency, persistence, and partnership. He knew about this to become the great master that he was. An interesting thing happened in 1937. The World's Fair made its way to Paris, and the government of Spain commissions Picasso, the greatest painter from Spain, living in Paris, to paint a large mural. He could paint anything that he wanted. And Picasso is revisiting a common theme, and it was called The Painter and His Model. And indeed, he had done some form of this at least 8 or 9 times. Now, what's happening in Spain, though, is the Spanish Civil War. On the 26th of April, 1937, in Guernica, Spain, it's known as Market Day. The market is an open space filled with over 10,000 people, farmers from all over, children, people are getting married in churches, exchanging goods and services. And at that time, General Franco calls his friend Adolf Hitler to conduct 5 airstrikes over the course of 3 hours on Market Day. He wanted to eliminate the Basques that were living in that particular area. It was his ongoing attempt to overthrow the Spanish government. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Hitler's first known use of a blitzkrieg. 50 aircraft with 120 airmen bombarding thousands and thousands of pounds of bombs, refueling and going back. The city is completely destroyed. Up to 80% of the town is devastated, including a church. where they're having a wedding. The bride survives, the groom does not. More than 3,000 casualties occur this particular day. 2 days later, reporters finally make it in, and they see a priest giving funeral rites over a mass grave. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Spain's 9/11. Picasso is furious. He has an ambitious plan. He's been commissioned by the government of Spain to do a large mural in Paris. He's went through the 5 Ps that we've talked about today. This is what he went through as a boy, but now as an older man. How can he use the 5 Ps to solve his wicked problem known as Guernica? But it all starts with passion. Certainly he was hearing radio reports. He was seeing things. The uncanny thing is, there's an eerie omen. Picasso almost knew that something bad was going to happen. This is a lithograph known as The Dreams and Lies of Franco. And in it are some of the common images that you will find in Guernica. A weeping woman, a bull, a horse, a dead child, a woman holding a handkerchief over her face. A mask reveals and conceals. He has this gigantic mural. This is what it looks like with another person standing in front of it. 11.5 feet long, 25 feet long, 11.5 feet tall. Purpose, he has an impossible deadline. Guernica bombing is on the 26th of April, 1937. He has exactly 24 days to create this gigantic mural. He sketches right away. This is the original sketch of Guernica. In his studio, he has to slant the canvas because it's not tall enough. He has to use a ladder to paint up high. He's on his hands and knees to paint down low. And Picasso had to take a stand right away. And it had to stand as art before propaganda, or it would be dismissed. And in fact, this historian says the stand of Picasso was quite clear. A work of art must be effective as a work of art if it's going to be political. Proficiency. He had went through a bunch of stages at this point. He once said, I begin with an idea and it becomes something else. He takes elements from the blue period, the rose period, and Cubism. There are even secret images that can be found within Guernica that are overlapping. You can move it in a different direction and even find more images. There's a bull, a skull, and an arrow. He has these hidden images to have a psychological effect on people. There's no real central point yet. From his neoclassical period, you can find balance within this particular painting. At one point, there was a raised fist within it to support the folks of Guernica, yet that's too much propaganda. He eliminates the center to have no focal point, again, to show the chaos and devastation that had occurred on market day. He moves the bull closer to the woman when he's almost finished with the painting, almost starting over. A painting is never thought out and decided ahead of time. It changes while you're doing it. If you're a creator or a designer, you know this. As you start to do your work, you get smarter. Things have to change. He produced 45 different sketches right away. Only 6 are on the whole concept. Here is the first iteration. Notice how he has the sun, the grain, and the raised fist. Too much propaganda. So the second iteration looks like this. He adds grain and a sun to the background. This is clearly an outdoor scene. The bull is scanning the horizon almost as if it wants to attack something. The focal point may have came directly from you. Here is the third iteration of Guernica. Notice how he's removed the soldier's arms. The grain is gone. The sun image is now something else. You can start to make out the triangle that balances the chaos, yet you still have that central point. Here is the fourth iteration. He moves the horse's head up. It hides other images. The horse is not dead, and you can see it just below the sun. The horse is in incredible agony. It is in the act of dying. And the bull is no longer looking at you. He's looking over his shoulder, confused in daze. Here is the final design of Guernica. The sun is now a light bulb. The Spanish term for light bulb is bombilla, reminiscent of the bombs on market day. It's now an artificial light. It's enclosed. Everybody is trapped. It's no longer an outdoor scene. In order to produce this fantastic masterpiece, he had to partner with Dora Maar. Dora Maar is also known as the Weeping Woman. The handkerchief cry over the crying face. Again, a mask reveals and conceals. She helped Picasso find a studio, photographs his progress, and she is the only artist to actually co-create. She put the finishing touches on a Picasso. It's initially rejected, however, by historians. According to historians, it's initially rejected. Guernica is jerky, compact. The people at the World's Fair are coming just to be inspired. Picasso says, "I stand for peace against war" in 1953. As it turns out, Nelson Rockefeller would say that this is a brilliant anti-war masterpiece a few years later. Franco would win in Spain. Guernica would not come back until Franco was dead, and the legitimate government was restored. That would occur after Picasso had died. There's an interesting discussion between a Gestapo officer and Picasso when they look at Guernica. The Gestapo officer said, "Did you create that?" And Picasso said, "No, you did." These are the 5 P's of productivity that we talked about today. Purpose, that's the fuel that drives you. Passion is the fuel that drives you. Purpose is the engine. Proficiency is your mastery of tools and techniques. Persistence is what you need when you get stuck. Partnerships helps you solve wicked problems. We didn't want to leave you today without talking about the final P. We call it the unspoken P.
And that's price. As Brian and I were developing this presentation, we had come up with the 5 Ps and we had ended. And we had a discussion on there's going to be something in your mind. I'm a mom, I'm a dad, I have other things in my life to do. It'd be great if I had a studio and could lock myself away and go swimming and have a siesta and do all these things. And maybe I could be as productive as Picasso. So we said, what price did Picasso pay to be as productive as he was? We keep coming back to this number, 147,800 completed works. That is unbelievable. That's unbelievable. We're like, man, I got one project. It's due next week. Right? So we examined the 7 traits of workaholics. Hello, workaholic. But what stood out was narcissism and perfectionism. Picasso said there's no such thing as a bad Picasso. Perfectionism is rooted in fear. By the way, I'm going to be developing a talk on perfectionism, so stay tuned. But Picasso's answer to the fear of perfectionism was more narcissism. He said, if I'm perfect, everything I do is perfect. We probably have bosses like that. He had 8 major women in his life, and he would often cheat on all of them at the same time. He would get obsessed. In one year, he did over 70 portraits of his second wife, Jacqueline. But he constantly isolated himself. In fact, he was even exiled from his own country when Franco came to rule, as Brian talked about. And he would promote the idea that he was a crazy artist. And sometimes randomly at night in his studio, he would just shoot off a gun to let people know, stay away, I'm working. Even his peers hated him. As a matter of fact, Diego Rivera first loved Picasso. When he met Picasso, he said, I never believed in God, but I believe in Picasso. And then just months later, he said, Picasso paces around the Louvre like a dog in search of game. And then at the end of their relationship, he accused Picasso of plagiarism, and Picasso does collaboration. He told his wife, or the mother of his children, he said, you know, women are either goddesses or doormats, so she packed up the kids and left. He decided not to pay any attention and didn't do any child support. When she wrote a tell-all book, he basically disowned the children, and they were even turned away at the funeral. Interestingly enough, Claude is the executor of the estate today. Picasso said, it is not what the artist does that matter, that counts, but what he is. Now, clearly he's talking about his brand. But if we look at his character and how he lived his life, it gives a new spin on him. So, you can produce like Picasso. You can, and everybody does, go through the 5 P's of productivity. But to what extreme you do this is entirely up to you. Who do you see when you look in the mirror? What price are you willing to pay? In ancient times, our teachers used to tell their students, finishing is better than starting. This has been